Does God exist? The question opens up three distinct levels of response: the epistemological, the empirical, and the ontological. From an epistemological point of view, the question is irresolvable because it exceeds the limits of what the human mind can justify as knowledge. It's not just that we lack proof, but that the very concept of proof belongs to a cognitive framework that operates within the physical world, within space and time. A being that, by definition, would be outside those categories could not be verified using the same criteria we apply to objects in the world. Empirically or factually, its existence has also not been verified. No one has seen it, and that fact is not trivial. The visible, the auditable, the measurable, everything that our experience captures constitutes the minimum basis for affirming that something is, that something exists. As a foundation of knowledge, testimonies are not enough to establish truths about the existence of something. If that were enough, humanity would have accepted the existence of UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, the Yeti, or any other extraordinary phenomenon witnessed by someone centuries ago. Testimony, in and of itself, only reveals the interpretation of a consciousness, not the objective existence of the phenomenon in question. But then a deeper, more paradoxical question arises. How is it possible that the most powerful being in the universe, if such a being existed, would depend on human testimonies and faith to be recognized? What kind of omnipotent entity, creator of galaxies, physical laws, and human consciousness itself, would have its presence subject to the fragility of a witness's account, the subjective confidence of belief, or oral tradition? The things that surround us at this very moment truly exist, and they don't require faith to manifest themselves before us. They are simply here. The sun doesn't need us to believe in it to illuminate us. Gravity doesn't demand devotion to act upon our bodies. Even our thoughts, though invisible, manifest themselves in actions, emotions, and language. Authentic existence imposes itself. It does not depend on being proclaimed or validated. The paradox is then evident. If God is the being who has always existed, the reason for all that exists, the absolute source of being, how is it that he does not appear with the same ontological force as that which he supposedly created? For example, a simple chair. The question, does God exist, is poorly formulated. It does not address the core of human experience, nor what constitutes its authentic need. In its classic form, the question presupposes that human beings' interest in God is intellectual, theoretical, almost mathematical. But this is rarely the case. For most, God is not an object of philosophical contemplation but an emotional talisman, an ontological amulet that purports to guarantee well-being, prevent misfortunes, ward off illness, and offer refuge from the brutal indifference of the world. The traditional question is misguided because it assumes that people seek truth, when in reality they seek comfort. It attempts to measure God's existence using epistemological criteria, while most people invoke God as an effective device. The average human being, subsumed by the urgencies of daily survival, has never had the luxury of engaging with subtle ontological distinctions. Their questions are not those of Aristotle or Kant. They are those of someone who suffers, fears, and desires to remain safe. And from this perspective, God becomes less a metaphysical hypothesis than a mechanism for emotional and social regulation. Therefore, the truly revealing question is not, do you believe in God? Or does God exist? But rather, why do you need God to exist? This latter question does not seek facts, but motivations. It does not delve into the cosmos, but into the needs of the individual. Through it, the internal structure of our deficiencies, our fears, and our hopes emerges, not a being who creates everything. Why does someone need God to exist? Faith is a constant struggle. It is not a tranquil certainty, but an agonizing struggle to believe that individual life will endure beyond physical death. Thus, God is a creation of the human yearning not to die. Belief in God arises from despair in the face of the prospect of eternal nothingness. As Don Miguel de Unamuno suggested, God's primary function is to guarantee eternity or personal immortality. Unamuno, like ordinary people, doesn't approach the existence of God from the perspective of logic or pure reason, but rather from what he calls the tragic sense of life, which is the internal struggle between reason, which tells us that we will die completely, and the heart or feeling, which rebels against this annihilation and creates a cognitive patch to reassure ourselves, deceive ourselves, and continue living normally. The drones of the collective, that human conglomerate that lives more by cultural inertia than by genuine reflection, have always believed in some version of salvation, a supreme end that awaits us at the end of our biological life. And they have assumed, without question, that the gods are the guarantors of this promised eternity. If we look at two religions widely accepted by this same collective, Christianity and Islam, we find two radically different paths towards salvation or damnation. Both claim to possess the ultimate truth, but their divergent soteriological structures reveal that it is not the truth that is at stake, but rather the way in which each tradition attempts to resolve the ontological fragility of humankind. Christianity. Its fundamental beliefs. Humanity is born in sin, inheriting it from the first human being. Faith in Jesus Christ is the only way to be saved. Good works do not grant salvation, but they reflect true faith. Believing in Christ and his path is the only way. The sacrifice of Jesus atones for all sin, making salvation possible. According to this, Christianity proposes a narrative of fall and redemption. Humanity is born in sin, not by its own act but by ontological inheritance. The world begins already under an existential deficit. Salvation does not depend on moral action or the inner construction of being, but on accepting the sacrifice of a divine intermediary. It is a heteronymous soteriology. Salvation comes from outside and does not arise from the subject's effort to transform themselves. Works do not save, they only bear witness to the correct faith. The individual may be ethically deficient, but if they believe in the canonical Christ, they remain ontologically secure. Islam. Its fundamental beliefs. Every soul is born pure. Sin is personal, not inherited. Salvation is through faith in one God and following his guidance. Good works and repentance are necessary along with faith. Forgiveness comes directly from God. No blood sacrifice is required. According to the above, Islam, on the other hand, starts from a premise closer to ontological neutrality. Every soul is born pure. Sin is neither inherited nor transmitted. Salvation depends on faith in one God, but also on conduct. Works matter, they carry weight, and they determine who the subject is in a moral and ontological sense. Here, soteriology is cooperative. God forgives, but the individual must align their being with divine guidance. Eternity is not an unconditional gift. Two paths. Two anthropologies. Two readings of the human being. However, there is a third, radically different alternative, and perhaps the only one that dispenses with religious imagery and mythology. It is salvation considered as a natural event. From this perspective, being saved is not a metaphysical prize bestowed by a deity, nor a state acquired through doctrinal adherence, but a process analogous to the great evolutionary cycles of nature. Think of the birth of clownfish offspring or the desperate struggle of newborn turtles making their way to the ocean. Only a minority, those who are better constituted, who have developed sufficient inner capacities, manages to survive and transcend. In this natural soteriology, temples, priests, and gods are unnecessary. And yes, it is understandable that this assertion makes the collective uncomfortable, as it deprives the individual of the comfortable notion that their salvation depends on a third party or a ritual formula. Here, salvation is possible not through faith, obedience, or worship, but rather through transformation of being. Salvation is merit, not a gift, fruit, not a decree. A being who cultivates themselves, who grows, who knows themselves, who expands their ontological potential, who ceases to live anemically in ontopenia, that poverty of being, that ontic insufficiency of those who have never developed themselves, is the only one who possesses the natural conditions to continue existing beyond dissolution. In this model, eternity is a natural consequence of the authenticity of being. What is authentically constituted endures. What is inauthentic, what is ontopenic, is extinguished. From this perspective, the problem of forgiveness takes on a completely different dimension. Forgiveness, as administered by religion, guarantees no real transformation. The offender remains on good terms with the authorities, but their being remains the same, without inner evolution. Their soul, if we can call it that, remains sick, remains fragile, remains even closer to ontological death. Confessing, repenting, performing a ritual, none of that builds being. Crimes may be absolved, but the subject who committed them remains the same kind of individual, continues to live under the regime of ontopenia. Therefore, forgiveness, understood as absolution without transformation, is the greatest of sins, because it numbs the individual to their own poverty of being. The thief who is forgiven without making amends for what was stolen, or the murderer who is declared reconciled without taking responsibility for the harm caused, are transformed into even weaker, more inconsistent souls, even less suited to any form of natural eternity. This religious forgiveness is, in reality, an ontological trap. In contrast, natural soteriology affirms that salvation is a direct consequence of existential merit. One is saved because one has undertaken the work of building a solid, expansive, conscious, and authentic being. Salvation is not a concession. It is a result. It is neither inherited nor given as a gift. It is earned. Eternity, then, would not be a privilege granted by a partial divinity, but the natural destiny of those few who have managed to emerge from ontopenia and attain an authenticity of being robust enough that their existence does not end with the death of the body. If we examine natural soteriology more closely, we discover that its strength lies not in offering a new dogma, but in dismantling a structure of dependency that has weakened humankind for centuries. This weakness is religious ontopenia, the poverty of being, the inner anemia, the lack of ontological consistency. It is a way of living without self-construction, without self-knowledge. Ontopenia arises when the individual relinquishes their existential responsibility to external entities, be they gods, authorities, spiritual leaders, or belief systems, that promise salvation without demanding transformation. This voluntary renunciation of self-construction is the root cause of inauthenticity. The self does not grow, expand, or mature because it delegates its own metamorphosis to external discourses. In this sense, the canonical Christ is not simply a religious figure, but an ontological model that has shaped the human understanding of salvation, guilt, and merit for centuries. The canonical Christ is a guarantee of damnation. As we have already stated, the ontological harm of the canonical Christ, as presented by traditional Christian soteriology, lies in delegated ontopenia. Salvation depends exclusively on the sacrifice of the other. The individual is absolved of the responsibility of constructing their own being. Redemption becomes an external, unilateral event that occurs without the subject's authentic participation. This generates a profoundly dependent, passive, and heteronymous form of existence. Under this model, it doesn't matter if the individual transforms. It doesn't matter if their being grows or stagnates. It's enough to believe, enough to accept, enough to submit. Thus, the canonical Christ operates as a world model designed to keep human beings in an infantilized state, emotionally dependent, morally delegative, and ontologically anemic. Its main structure states, you cannot save yourself. You are insufficient. Your being is not enough to attain eternity. This narrative, repeated for centuries, establishes a type of identity that lacks self-confidence, fears its freedom, and renounces internal metamorphosis. Ontopenia becomes culture, a system, a spiritual pedagogy. And all of this fuels the perpetuation of the collective as an obedient mass, not as individuals in the process of authentication. Natural soteriology proposes a radical break with these models. Here, Salvation is not an external decree, but an internal emergence. It is the result of the work of the self. Eternity is not a grace, but an effect. It is not a privilege granted, but the consequence of having attained sufficient ontological density to avoid disappearing. In this framework, the question is no longer, who saves you? But rather, what have you become? Natural salvation operates under the logic of metamorphosis. Only that which is profoundly transformed, that which becomes robust, complex, expanded, and lucid, can transcend. Instead of depending on faith, it demands a form of inner craftsmanship, the construction of an authentic being. Traditionally, religions have conceived of the soul as a fixed essence, a pre-existing, unchanging, and by definition eternal entity. Under this view, the soul is not built, it is possessed. This notion, functional to heteronymous religious models, inevitably leads to inauthenticity. If the soul is already given, the subject does not have to perfect it, expand it, or nurture it with experience and understanding. They only have to take care of it. Natural soteriology proposes the opposite. The soul is not an essence. It is a process. The emergent soul. In this model, the soul is an emergent structure produced by the integration of experiences, decisions, learning, actions, silences, renunciations, and confrontations with oneself. It emerges slowly, like a crystal that grows layer by layer, each layer being a consequence of the previous one. It is not fully present at birth. It is partly potential, partly shadow, partly intuition. The soul is an architecture in motion. This conception radically transforms ethics, metaphysics, and anthropology. The soul can grow. The soul can atrophy. The soul can stagnate. The soul can empty itself until it disappears, maximum ontopenia. Well, thank you for your patient attention. Goodbye.